This lecture is about diagnostic cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography. Diagnostic cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography is the gold standard in the assessment of the anatomy and physiology of the heart and its associated vasculature. In 1929, Forsman demonstrated the feasibility of cardiac catheterization in humans when he passed a urological catheter from a vein in his arm to his right atrium and documented the catheter's position in the heart by X-ray or fluoroscopy. In 1940, Cournand and Richards applied this technique to patients with cardiovascular disease to evaluate the cardiac function. Medicine is not an exact science. Sometimes, treatment discoveries are not really what is intended. In medicine, most errors are mild. Some errors can be fatal, but it helps us prevent further fatalities. Some errors create history and redefine science. This is an example of an accident that turns out to be something positive. In 1958, Soames inadvertently performed the first selective coronary angiography when a catheter in the left ventricle slipped back across the aortic valve, engaged the right coronary artery, and power injected 40 ml of contrast down the vessel. The resulting angiogram provided superb anatomic detail of the artery, and the patient suffered no adverse events or effects.
My husband.
So what are the indications for cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography? They are indicated to evaluate the extent and severity of cardiac disease in symptomatic patients and to determine if medical, surgical, or catheter-based interventions are warranted. Also, they are used to exclude severe disease in symptomatic patients with equivocal findings on non-invasive studies and in patients with chest pain syndromes of unclear etiology for whom a definitive diagnosis is necessary for the management. Cardiac catheterization is not mandatory prior to cardiac surgery in some younger patients who have congenital or valvular heart disease that is well defined by non-invasive imaging and who do not have symptoms or risk factors that suggest concomitant coronary artery disease. Cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography is also indicated to diagnose coronary artery disease even in symptomatic or asymptomatic individuals, for those who have high risk for adverse outcome based on non-invasive testing, with history of sudden cardiac death, those who suffered sustained monomorphic ventricular tachycardia, or non-sustained polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. They are also indicated in symptomatic patients, especially, for example, those with Canadian Cardiology Society Class 2, 3, or 4 stable angina on medical treatment, those with acute coronary syndrome like unstable angina or non-ST elevation myocardial infarction, or chest pain syndrome of unclear etiology and with equivocal findings on non-invasive tests. Procedures are also indicated in patients with ST segment elevation myocardial infarction for the purpose of reperfusion with primary percutaneous coronary intervention, for persistent or recurrent ischemia, for those who suffered pulmonary edema and or reduced ejection fraction, those who had cardiogenic shock or hemodynamic instability, for risk stratification, or for patients with positive stress test after the acute myocardial infarction, and for those who had mechanical complications of myocardial infarction like mitral regurgitation and ventricular septal defect.
I don't know.
They are also indicated among patients with valvular heart disease if you suspect severe valve disease in symptomatic patients, like those who have dyspnea, angina, heart failure, and syncope, for patients with infective endocarditis with need for cardiac surgery, for asymptomatic patients with aortic regurgitation and cardiac enlargement or depressed ejection fraction, and prior to cardiac surgery in patients with suspected coronary artery disease.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Expensive.
Cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography is also indicated for patients presenting with congestive heart failure, especially if this is new onset, presenting also with angina, or if you are suspecting undiagnosed coronary artery disease. Also, for new onset cardiomyopathy of uncertain cause or suspected to be due to coronary artery disease.
Expensive.
Di ba yung sunod talaga?
In patients with congenital heart disease, cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography is indicated prior to surgical correction when symptoms or non-invasive testing suggest coronary disease, or if you have suspicion for congenital coronary anomalies. In pericardial disease, it is indicated for symptomatic patients with suspected cardiac tamponade or constrictive pericarditis. Cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography likewise is indicated for patients who will undergo cardiac transplantation pre-operatively and post-surgical evaluation. Other conditions that needs those procedures are hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with angina, diseases of the aorta, when knowledge of coronary artery involvement is necessary for the management. This is just a slide on the table for the indications of coronary angiography and cardiac catheterization taken from your reference book, Harrison. Please try to memorize the indication. In patients who understand and accept the risk associated with cardiac catheterization, there are no absolute contraindications when the procedure is performed in anticipation of a life-saving intervention. Relative contraindications, however, do exist. These are decompensated congestive heart failure, acute renal failure, severe chronic renal insufficiency unless dialysis is planned, bacteremia, acute stroke, active gastrointestinal bleeding, severe uncorrected electrolyte abnormalities, a history of allergy to iodinated contrast agent, history of allergy or bronchospasm to aspirin. Once the problems are corrected, the patient can proceed with the procedure. If the patient has allergy to aspirin, then other antiplatelets can also be used prior to the procedure if planned PCI is likely. The risks associated with elective cardiac catheterization are relatively low, with reported risk of 0.05% for myocardial infarction, 0.07% for stroke, and 0.08 to 0.14% for death. The risk increases substantially if the catheterization is performed emergently during an acute myocardial infarction or in hemodynamically unstable patients. Vascular access site bleeding is the most common complication occurring in 1.5 to 2% of patients, with major bleeding events associated with worse short and long-term outcome. Contrast allergy and contrast-induced acute kidney injury merit further consideration because these adverse events may occur in otherwise healthy individuals and prophylactic measures exist to reduce the risk. Allergic reactions to contrast media happens in less than 0.5% of cases. Severe anaphylactic reactions happen in 0.1 to 0.2% of patients. Mild reactions manifest as nausea, vomiting, and urticaria. Severe reactions can lead to hypotensive shock, pulmonary edema, and cardiorespiratory arrest. To prevent this, patients should be pre-medicated with corticosteroids and antihistamine, and also the use of non-ionic low osmolar contrast agents. Contrast-induced acute kidney injury is defined as increase in serum creatinine of more than 0.5 milligrams per dl or 25% above the baseline that occurs 48 to 72 hours after contrast administration. This occurs in 2 to 7% of patients undergoing cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography. 20 to 30% are reported in high-risk patients like diabetes mellitus, congestive heart failure, those with existing chronic kidney disease, anemia, and old age. Dialysis is required in 0.3 to 0.7% of patients, and if this happens, it is associated with a five-fold increase in in-hospital mortality. So how do you prevent or manage contrast-induced acute kidney injury? There should be adequate intravascular volume expansion with intravenous plain NSS computed at 1 to 1.5 ml per kilogram per hour to be given 3 to 12 hours before and continued 6 to 24 hours after the procedure. For those patients who are taking metformin, it should be stopped at least 48 hours prior to the procedure to limit the associated risk of lactic acidosis. Lactic acidosis can predispose also to increase in the incidence of contrast-induced acute kidney injury. Sodium bicarbonate can also be used to be given at 3 ml per kilogram per hour, 1 hour before and 6 hours after. Use of low or isoosmolar contrast agents and limiting the volume of contrast to less than 100 ml per procedure can also prevent the contrast-induced acute kidney injury. So how do we prepare patients prior to cardiac catheterization? They should go on fasting for 6 hours. They should receive IV or oral conscious sedation to remain awake but sedated during the procedure. All patients with suspected coronary artery disease are pre-treated with 325 mg of aspirin. In patients whom the procedure is likely to progress to percutaneous coronary intervention, an additional antiplatelet should be started. Warfarin is held 2 to 3 days prior to procedure, allowing the INR to fall below 1.7. Vascular access. This is performed using a percutaneous technique to enter the femoral artery and vein, and they are the preferred access sites for left and right heart catheterization respectively. A flexible sheath is then inserted into the vessel over a guide wire, allowing diagnostic catheters to be introduced into the vessel and advanced toward the heart using fluoroscopic guidance. The radial and brachial artery likewise can be used as access for cardiac catheterization and coronary angiogram. And also, if your patients have peripheral arterial disease that involves the abdominal aorta, iliac or femoral vessels, or for patients with severe iliac artery tortuosity, for patients with morbid obesity, And also this is used because of preference for early post-procedure ambulation, and also it has lower rate of access site bleeding complications. Allen's test is used in confirming dual blood supply to the hand from the radial and ulnar arteries, and this is recommended prior to access at the radial artery sites. The internal jugular or antecubital vein serves as alternate access site to the right heart when the patient has an inferior vena cava filter in place or requires prolonged hemodynamic monitoring. So what is the purpose of right heart catheterization? This measures the pressures in the right heart, but this is no longer a routine part of diagnostic cardiac catheterization. However, they are reasonable in patients with unexplained dyspnea, valvular heart disease, pericardial disease, right and or left ventricular dysfunction, congenital heart disease, and suspected intracardiac shunts. Right heart catheterization uses a balloon tip flotation catheter that is advanced sequentially to the right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, and pulmonary wedge position, and using fluoroscopic guidance. The wedge position will serve as a surrogate for left atrial pressure. In each cardiac chamber, pressure is measured and blood samples are obtained for oxygen saturation analysis to screen for intracardiac shunts. Left heart catheterization measures the pressure in the left heart as a determinant of left ventricular performance. With the aid of fluoroscopy, a catheter is guided to the ascending aorta and across the aortic valve into the left ventricle. The left heart may also be accessed via a transeptal technique from the right atrium using a needle tip catheter to puncture the atrial septum at the fossa ovalis.
Who is Alice? Why do we need force of Alice?
A comprehensive hemodynamic assessment involves obtaining pressure measurements in the right and left heart and peripheral arterial system and determining the cardiac output. The figure is just to show you the normal waveform appearance of the right atrium, the right ventricle, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary capillary wedge, the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the aorta. If you will look closely, the appearance of pressure waveforms in both atria, the both ventricles, and both arteria or major arteries are almost the same. This is just a table that will show us the normal values of the pressures inside the chambers. The right atrial mean pressure is between 0 to 5. The right ventricular systolic pressure is between 17 to 32, and diastolic pressure of 1 to 7. The pulmonary artery pressure is between 17 to 32 millimeters mercury, and diastolic pressure of 1 to 7 with a mean of 9 to 19. The pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is around 4 to 12. Take note of the pressure in the right atrium, the diastolic pressure in the right ventricle, and the diastolic pressure in the pulmonary artery. They are all the same. Left atrial pressure has a mean of 4 to 12. The left ventricular pressure is between 90 to 130 systolic and 5 to 12 diastolic. The aortic pressure is between 90 to 130 systolic and 60 to 85 diastolic with a mean pressure of 70 to 100. Take note also of the pressure in the LA, as well as the diastolic pressure of the left ventricle is almost the same. Systolic pressure of the left ventricle and the aorta is the same. So if you combine all the pressures simultaneously in all chambers, and this is how will it look like, and if you try to remember the Wieger cycle in the cardiac cycle lecture, so this is the summary of all the pressures inside the heart. So normal hemodynamic waveforms recorded during right heart catheterization. The figure will show us how normal waveforms look like in the right atrium or RA, right ventricle or RV, the PA, and the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Atrial pressure tracings have a characteristic A wave that reflects atrial contraction and a V wave that reflects pressure changes in the atrium during ventricular systole. Ventricular pressure tracings have a low pressure diastolic filling period and a sharp rise in pressure that occurs during ventricular systole. So these are examples of abnormal pressure recordings. The figure on the left side is when aortic stenosis is present. There is systolic pressure gradient between the left ventricle and the aorta. If you can remember, the systolic pressure of the aorta and the left ventricle should be equal. In this figure, you can see that the left ventricular pressure is higher than the aortic pressure with a gradient or difference of more than 50. In the rightmost figure, this is when mitral stenosis is present. You can see there is diastolic pressure gradient between the pulmonary capillary wedge or left atrial pressure and the left ventricle. Remember, the diastolic pressure of the atria and the ventricle should be equal. In this patient, there is a difference of more than 10 millimeters mercury between the wedge or atrial pressure and the left ventricular diastolic pressure. Cardiac catheterization can also use to determine if there is significant intracardiac pressure gradient among patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So we can do the broken Broadwell sign or maneuver. So following a premature ventricular contraction, there is an increase in the left ventricular to aorta pressure gradient with a simultaneous decrease in the aortic pulse pressure. Hemodynamic measurements are also used to differentiate between tamponade, constrictive pericarditis, and restrictive cardiomyopathy. In cardiac tamponade, the right atrial pressure is increased with a decrease or absent Y descent, indicative of impaired right atrial emptying in diastole, and there is a diastolic equalization of pressures in all the cardiac chambers. In constrictive pericarditis, the right atrial pressure is elevated with a prominent Y descent, indicating a rapid filling of the right ventricle during early diastole. A diastolic dip and plateau or square root sign in the ventricular waveforms due to abrupt halt or stop in ventricular filling pressure in diastole is also observed. The right ventricle and pulmonary artery pressures are elevated, and discordant pressure changes in the right ventricle and left ventricle with inspiration is likewise noted, meaning an increase in right ventricular pressure while the left ventricular pressure is decreased. And this is the most specific sign for constrictive pericarditis. In restrictive cardiomyopathy, this may be distinguished from constrictive pericarditis by a marked increase in right ventricular and pulmonary artery pressure by more than 60 millimeters mercury, a separation of the left ventricular and right ventricular diastolic pressure of more than 5 millimeters mercury, and a concordant changes in the right ventricle and left ventricular diastolic filling pressure with inspiration. The next four slides are about computation of the cardiac output, vascular resistance, and valve area. Please try to memorize and understand these formulas. The cardiac output is measured by the Fick method or the thermodilution technique or calculated from left ventricular angiography. This uses oxygen as the indicator substance. The cardiac output in liters per minute is calculated as the oxygen consumption in ml per minute divided by the arterial venous oxygen difference in ml per liter. The oxygen consumption is estimated as 125 ml oxygen per minute times the body surface area. The oxygen carrying capacity of blood is computed as the hemoglobin concentration in grams per deciliter times 1.36 ml per gram of hemoglobin times 10 times the fractional oxygen saturation. So how will you compute for the vascular resistance? For the systemic vascular resistance, it is computed as the mean arterial pressure minus the mean right atrial pressure divided by the cardiac output times AT. For the pulmonary vascular resistance, it is computed as the mean pulmonary artery pressure minus the mean pulmonary capillary wedge pressure divided by the cardiac output times AT. So how will you compute for the valve area? We can use either the Gorlin formula or the Heike formula. The Gorlin formula states that the valve area in centimeters squared is equal to the flow across the valve in ml per second divided by the product of two constants and the square root of pressure difference across the valve. So the formula is cardiac output divided by the diastolic filling period or systolic ejection period times the heart rate divided by 37.7 for mitral or 44.5 for aortic times the square root of the pressure gradient. So computation of the valve area using the modified Haki formula is quite simple. The formula is the cardiac output in liters per minute divided by the square root of the pressure gradient across the valve. For intracardiac shunts, a shunt should be suspected when there is unexplained arterial desaturation or increased oxygen saturation of venous blood. Shunt is localized by detecting a difference in oxygen saturation levels of between 5 to 7% between adjacent cardiac chambers. If you want to know the significance of the shunt, you should compute for the QP and QS. The QP is the blood flow in the pulmonic circulation, and the blood flow in the systemic circulation is QS. This is just a simple explanation. And the formula is systemic arterial oxygen content minus the mixed venous oxygen content divided by the pulmonary vein oxygen content minus the pulmonary artery oxygen content. So normally, the blood flow in the pulmonary circulation equals that of the systemic circulation. So QP equals the QS. So that if there is left to right shunting, meaning blood coming from the left chambers go to the right chambers, the QP or the blood flow in the pulmonary circulation will now be higher than the systemic circulation. Hence, QP is now more than QS. So for an atrial septal defect, A shunt ratio of 1.5 is considered significant and factored with other clinical variables to determine the need for intervention. When a congenital ventricular septal defect is present, a shunt ratio of 2 with evidence of left ventricular volume overload is a class 1 indication for surgical correction. Ventriculography is used to assess the left ventricular function. The cardiac output may also be calculated from the left ventriculogram by first determining the left ventricular volumes in end diastole and end systole using the area length method. It can also show wall motion abnormality, also degree of mitral regurgitation and the presence of ventricular septal defect. The picture on the right side of the slide in the upper part showing to you the picture of a normal left ventricle during end diastole and end systole. If you will look at the end systolic picture, you will see that there is almost complete obliteration of the opacification or the left ventricular cavity because of ejection of the contrast media into the aorta. The lower pictures will show you that the one with pointed arrows, you will see that during systole, the part of the mid to apical areas did not contract very well. Hence, a big amount of dye still remains in that area. So this is left ventriculogram showing mitral regurgitation. The picture on the right side of the slide, the upper one, this is a picture of a normal left ventricular function, wherein the content of the left ventricle is discharged towards the aorta during systole. If you look at the lower picture, the opacification during systole is seen both in the aorta and in the left atrium, and this is because of the mitral regurgitation. Mitral regurgitation can be graded using the Seller's classification as mild, moderate, and severe. You can also categorize it as mild +1, moderate +2, moderate to severe +3, and severe +4, depending on the opacification of the left atrium after each contraction. Ventriculography also can be used to diagnose ventricular septal defect. Ventriculography performed in the left anterior oblique projection can be used to identify a ventricular septal defect. Looking at the picture on the right side, you can see simultaneous opacification of both the left ventricle and the right ventricle, and the ventricular septal defect is labeled as such in the upper part of the ventricles. So ventriculography can also be used as a means to calculate the cardiac output. So the formula is the stroke volume times the heart rate. So using the end diastolic and end systolic images, we can try to compute or compute for the volume of the chambers. So if the end diastolic volume is measured to be 144 ml and the end systolic volume is measured to be 60 ml, then the stroke volume is around 84 ml. So if you multiply it with the number of heart rate, then you can get the cardiac output in ml per minute. If you want to get the ejection fraction, so the formula is the stroke volume divided by the end diastolic volume times 100. So for example, 84 ml divided by 144 ml times 100, and the ejection fraction is 58%.
Yes, pagkatapos
Aortography is used to identify abnormalities of the ascending aorta, including aneurysmal dilatation and involvement of the great vessels, as well as the presence of dissection with compression of the true lumen by an intimal flap that separates the true and false lumina. It can also identify shunts such as a patent ductus arteriosus, and also provide a qualitative assessment of aortic regurgitation using a scale similar to that used for mitral regurgitation. Cine fluoroscopy can also be used to diagnose dysfunction of the prosthetic mechanical valves. The incidence of prosthetic valve thrombosis in the left side is around 0.1 to 6% per patient per year. And this will visualize the motion of mechanical valve leaflet. This is non-invasive, available in most centers, and can be performed rapidly with minimal radiation exposure. The picture on the lower part of the slide will tell us the presence of a mechanical valve in the aortic position, so that during diastole, the valve leaflets are closed. During systole, only one leaflet is open. The one with the asterisk, you can see that the leaflet is not opening well, and this is a sign of mechanical valve dysfunction. Selective coronary angiography is almost always performed during a cardiac catheterization. It is used to define the coronary anatomy and determine the extent of epicardial coronary artery and coronary artery bypass graft disease. This visualizes coronary artery stenosis as luminal narrowings on the cine angiogram as shown in the picture on the right, as depicted by an arrow. You will see that the one pointed by the arrow has a smaller lumen than the normal side or normal segments. The degree of narrowing is referred to as the percent stenosis and is determined visually by comparing the most severely diseased segment, the one with the arrow, with a proximal or distal normal segment. And a stenosis of more than 50% is considered significant. Please review the normal coronary artery anatomy. The coronary arteries are highly variable between individuals. There are two coronary ostia, one on the left and one on the right, with three major vessels. The left main coronary artery gives rise to the left anterior descending and the left circumflex, and the right coronary artery comes from the right coronary ostia. Sometimes there is another branch coming from the left main coronary artery, and that is the ramus intermedius branch.
Nikki.
So these are several pictures of how a normal coronary artery will look like. The one on the leftmost, or labeled A, coronary angiogram showing the left circumflex artery and its obtuse marginal branches. The left anterior descending artery is also seen in this view. The middle picture is the LAD artery, or left anterior descending artery, and its diagonal branches, and they are best seen in cranial views. In this angiogram, the left main coronary artery is also seen. The rightmost picture is the right coronary artery, and it gives off the posterior descending artery, so this is a right dominant circulation. So this is just a table again to review the indications of for cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography. Please try to memorize and understand. This is in your reference book. So quantitative coronary angiography can provide a more accurate assessment of the percent stenosis and lessen the tendency to overestimate the lesion severity visually. Sometimes we tend to overestimate or underestimate by using the visual method, or by just looking at the degree of stenosis. So each cath lab machine can determine the percent stenosis more accurately than the visual estimate. So a myocardial bridge occurs when a portion of the vessel dips below the epicardial surface into the myocardium and is subject to compressive forces during ventricular systole. The most commonly involved artery is the left anterior descending artery. And the key to differentiating a myocardial bridge from a fixed stenosis is that the stenosed part of the vessel returns to normal during diastole. So looking at the picture on the right side of the heart, of the slide, you can see that the one in diastole, seemingly that the artery appears normal, but during systole, there is obliteration of the artery, and it seems like there is significant stenosis in that part of the artery. So during diastole, the artery will again look like normal. The next few slides are about diagnostic modalities that can help us in the diagnosis and treatment of coronary artery disease. Intravascular ultrasound provides a more accurate anatomic assessment of the coronary artery and the degree of coronary atherosclerosis. A small flexible catheter with a 40 MHz transducer at its tip is advanced into the coronary artery over a guide wire. This will image atherosclerotic plaque precisely, determine luminal cross-sectional area, and measure vessel size. This can assess the stenosis and determine the adequacy of stent placement. Significant stenosis in the coronary artery are seen as narrowing of the vessel during coronary angiography. If you look at the picture in the upper part of the slide, the one labeled A is a normal coronary artery segment. Letter B is an area with a mild disease. C is an area with a moderate disease, and D is an area with a severe disease. The lower part of the picture are IVUS images. The letter A is how a normal segment will look like in IVUS. Letter B and C are how an eccentric stenosis will look like in IVUS. Eccentric means only one side of the artery has a atherosclerotic plaque. And the letter D image is a near total obliteration of the lumen at the site of significant stenosis. Optical coherence tomography is also a catheter-based imaging technique that uses near-infrared light to generate images with better spatial resolution than IVUS. However, the depth of field is smaller. The advantage of OCT imaging over IVUS lies in its ability to image characteristics of the atherosclerotic plaque, looking into the lipid core and fibrous cap with high definition, and to assess coronary stent placement apposition as well. Fractional flow reserve, or FFR, is a functional assessment of the stenosis and is more accurate in predicting long-term clinical outcome than imaging techniques. The ratio of the pressure in the coronary artery distal to the stenosis is divided by the pressure in the artery proximal to the stenosis at maximal vasodilatation. This is measured using a coronary pressure sensor guide wire at rest and at maximal hyperemia following the injection of adenosine. And an FFR reserve of less than 0.8 indicates a hemodynamically significant stenosis that would benefit from intervention.
So ito fermented shit.
Once the procedure is completed, vascular access sheets are removed. If the femoral approach is used, direct manual compression or vascular closure devices that immediately close the arteriotomy site with a staple or clip, collagen plug, or sutures are used to achieve hemostasis. These devices decrease the length of supine bed rest from 6 hours to 2 to 4 hours, and this improves patient satisfaction. However, these have not shown definitely to be superior to manual compression with respect to access site complications. If the radial artery is used, both manual compression and closure devices can be used to produce hemostasis. This is the end of the lecture. Please review the normal anatomy, physiology, the normal pressures inside the heart, the indications in doing cardiac catheterization and coronary angiography, the possible risk or complications and how to manage them, and also try to look into the other modalities used in the diagnosis of coronary artery disease like the coronary angiogram, IVUS, OCT, and FFR, and also the formulas in the computation of cardiac output, vascular resistance, valve areas. Thank you very much.